Good morning. Good to see so many people out this morning. We want to welcome those that are tuning in on our live stream on Facebook. We're thankful that you are tuning in to us this morning. I'm going to ask you to turn your Bibles to the book of Daniel. So I've titled this lesson, Dare to Be Like Daniel. We're going to have a couple different texts from Daniel 1, verses 8 through 21, chapter 6, 1 through 10, and Daniel 9, 23. And we don't plan to read all of those, but those contain the context of what we're going to be looking at. The scriptures tell us of many godly men and women who are good examples. And one of those individuals is Daniel. In our Bible class this morning, Reuben mentioned that children of God have to be different. That children of God need to stand out. They have to be recognized as being different. Daniel was one such individual. He started out preeminent among the children of Israel. Daniel 1, 3 through 6. He was sought out by the king. He and his friends and the youths of Jerusalem, as they were captured, they were put into a program to teach them the ways of Babylonian culture and literature and wisdom, that they might be useful to the kingdom. And so we find that Daniel stood out even among the children of Israel, the youths who were taken. He was preeminent among the wise men of Babylon. Daniel 1, 17 to 20. In fact, Daniel 1 closes with Daniel and his three friends being brought before King Nebuchadnezzar. And Nebuchadnezzar finding these four youths wiser than any of the others that came out of that school. And in fact, in chapter 1, it says he put them to use in his court because he found them to be head and shoulders above everyone else in wisdom and literature and their culture. So they stood out. They were preeminent. And then at the end of Daniel chapter 2, verses 48 to 49, he stood out again when Daniel was promoted and given power over all of Babylon. He answered only to the king. He was prefect among the prefects. He was prefect over the entire province. But Daniel didn't forget his three friends. It says he requested of the king. And so the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He promoted them over the provinces of Babylon. But Daniel himself was promoted over all Babylon. And it happens a second time in chapter 5 and verse 29. Only this time, it's at the very end of Babylon's time as a nation and as a kingdom. But what I want to focus on is out of all of that, these are accolades given him by man. A foreign king saw his value. A foreign king promoted him to the position of power over all of Babylon. Later on, a descendant of King Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar, he's going to promote Daniel to third in the kingdom because he himself is second. His father is the true king. He's the regent. And so again, he gives the highest honor he can to Daniel by making him third in control in Daniel chapter 5 and verse 29. He was given similar power, that is over the Medo-Persian Empire. In Daniel chapter 6, 1 through 3 and verse 28. Not only was he recognized by Babylon, by Nebuchadnezzar and King Belshazzar, but he was also recognized by King Darius the Mede, who in Daniel chapter 6, 1 through 3, was going to promote Daniel over all the satraps. We talked about prefects over Babylon, but the Medo-Persian Empire, King Cyrus the Great set up satraps. These were another word for governor. Darius the Mede was going to make Daniel the governor over the Persian Empire. And the other satraps became jealous because of that, but we see it happen in verse 28. And so Daniel was given these accolades by men. The kings of Babylon and Persia recognized his value because he stood out. But perhaps the highest honor, in fact, I want to take back that perhaps. The highest honor came from God himself in Daniel chapter 9 and verse 23. Here, as he is praying, we're told, and we're going to look at this a little later on. As he's praying, an angel of God comes, and the angel of God says, at the beginning of your supplications, the command was issued, and I have come to tell you, for you are highly esteemed. So give heed to the message and gain understanding of the vision. God says of Daniel, as he's praying to him, he is highly esteemed. He was highly esteemed among men. And here God lets him know he was highly esteemed by God. Daniel is an example of how to have success without compromise. Dare to be like Daniel. And we might ask the question, how was Daniel able to reach these positions of power and influence without compromising his righteousness? How was he able to achieve second in command over Babylon, third of command over Babylon, second in command over Babylon under Darius the Mede? How was he able to achieve these things and yet be highly esteemed by God? He was a Jew in a pagan polytheistic system of government. The very government prophesied by Isaiah, Habakkuk, and Jeremiah to execute judgment against Judah. Habakkuk recognized when God told him who he was going to use to punish wicked Jerusalem. Habakkuk said they were a vicious, godless people. And God confirmed that, saying, yeah, you're going to see just how vicious they are. The Chaldeans, the Babylonians, were going to execute that judgment against God's people because they had forsaken him. So how did he rise to such power and remain unspotted by the world around him? And we could look at our own politicians and say, they don't do it. Someone has something over them. They have to commit certain things to get to where they are. How did Daniel get to where he was and maintain that righteousness and maintain that purity that God would say to him, highly esteemed? The book of Daniel reveals his secrets to a successful life that we can have without selling one's soul. And we're going to look at it in 4 different ways as we consider how we need to dare to be like Daniel. The first thing is purpose. Daniel was a man of purpose, even as a youth. In Daniel chapter 1 and verse 8, and we're going to read through verse 9. Daniel as a youth, this youth taken from Babylon, that means he's not yet 20. We don't know how old he is, but we know he's not counted as a man in the Jewish custom, so he is a youth. And we read this about him in captivity. But Daniel made up his mind that he would not defile himself with the king's choice food or with the wine which he drank. So he sought permission from the commander of the officials that he might not defile himself. Now God granted Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the commander of the officials. Notice how Daniel goes about this. He purposes in his mind that he's not going to defile himself. But he doesn't just secretly do it and say, I'm just going to pour out that wine. I'm going to toss the food to the nearest dog. No, he could get in trouble for that. God has always told Christians to abide by the law as far as it is possible. Notice what he does. He goes and he seeks permission from the commander of the officials so that he might not defile himself. What about all the other youths taken from Jerusalem? Why don't we read of them doing it too? But we read of 3 others, Daniel's 3 friends. And it worked. God granted him favor for making up his mind. The first thing we see these young men faced with is to violate God's law with the king's food. It would not be prepared the way they were used to. It would not be prepared according to the law of Moses, the law of God. It would not be kosher. It would not be what they were used to. They had no qualms about mixing the food with the blood, eating meat strangled. They had no problems with unclean food. There was no such thing as clean and unclean food. Food was food. And so Daniel asked for another way to make it possible. Even as a young man, he didn't sit the fence. But in the King James Version of Daniel 1:8, it says Daniel purposed in his heart to not be defiled by the king's food. Despite his youth, despite the obvious pressures to conform, we're told that he made up his mind to obey God no matter the cost. Because of his willingness to put God first, God granted him favor in the sight of others. Daniel chapter 1 and verse 9. Joseph was in a similar position. Perhaps Daniel was thinking of Joseph as he went through this ordeal himself. Joseph was put in a similar position. Joseph, once he was sold by his brothers into slavery, there is a long period of time Joseph has no control over his life. He's a slave in Potiphar's house, and what he can control, he does. He puts God first, and God blesses him, and that the house of Potiphar was blessed. Then as he is falsely accused and thrown in prison, God is still with him. He puts God first, and before long, he's second in command over the inmates in the prison. And we're told that the prison warden didn't have to micromanage anything because because Joseph was trustworthy. Joseph put God first, and God highly exalted him to a position second in command over all of Egypt. Perhaps Joseph was the inspiration for Daniel finding himself in captivity and saying, I'm going to put God first. I'm not going to adopt the mentality of when in Babylon, do as the Babylonians do. Joseph never did that as far as Egypt goes. His heart was always with God. In Genesis 39, 1-4, Genesis 39, 21-23, Genesis 41, 41-45, Joseph put God first, and God granted him favor with men and with God. You know, there's an application to this. Christians are to have purpose. What should the purpose of the Christian be? Jesus made it clear in Matthew 6:33 that we are to seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and then the things of the world, the necessities of life will be added to us. We have to have the purpose of seeking first his kingdom and his righteousness and let God do the rest. So many people forget that. They get caught up in their worldly cares and often wonder why they don't seem to get ahead. Don't forget God. Joseph didn't. Daniel didn't. Don't forget God. So many people, as they pursue their career, and they go up that corporate ladder and they see the top, they see where they want to be, and they forget about God and they trample under everyone else, whatever it takes to get to the top. Daniel didn't do that. Don't forget about God. Christians must have their minds made up to obey God, not to sit the fence. In 1 Kings 18, verse 21, Elijah condemned Israel for sitting the fence. He said, how long will you sit on the fence? How long will you be between two opinions? Either Baal is God or Yahweh is God. It can't be both. Choose which one and serve him. No matter how young one may be, it's not too late to seek first his kingdom and his righteousness. Daniel made up that mind. He was a man of purpose from a young age, and he never lost that drive. He never lost that purpose. Dare to be like Daniel and have the purpose to obey God in family affairs, in job affairs, your career affairs, in school affairs. Put God first. And don't forget who you are. Don't forget that you do not belong to the world. You belong to God. Daniel was a man of principle. The next P that we're going to look at. Daniel was a man of principle. He refused to compromise his convictions. In Daniel 1:8, 5:17, and 6:10, we're going to read all three of these. In Daniel 1:8, we read this earlier. Daniel made up his mind he would not defile himself with the king's choice food or with the wine which he drank. So he sought permission from the commander of the officials that he might not defile himself. Again, he followed the law. He did what he needed to do to not have to obey the king, but to still be in favor with the king. In Daniel chapter 5, verse 17, King Belshazzar wants to give gifts to Daniel for interpreting the writing on the wall. And it says, then Daniel answered and said before the king, keep your gifts for yourself or give your rewards to someone else. However, I will read the inscription to the king and make the interpretation known to him. Daniel was a man of principle. He refused the gifts of Belshazzar. In chapter 6 and verse 10, when Daniel knew that those who were jealous of him, who falsely accused him, and were looking for ways to falsely accuse him, but then rightly accused him of praying to God, it says, when Daniel knew that document was signed, he entered his house. Now in his roof chamber he had windows open toward Jerusalem. And he continued kneeling on his knees 3 times a day, praying and giving thanks before his God, as he had been doing previously. I want you to notice from these 3 passages, we get a lot of insight into the character of Daniel, about what kind of man of principle that he was. As a young man, he refused to eat or drink the king's food. This was a huge honor, to take these youths from Jerusalem, a foreign country, put them through this school that is going to give them jobs under this new administration of Babylon. And they got to eat food and drink from the king's own table. This was a huge honor. I want to direct your minds back to when David made this promise to Mephibosheth, Jonathan's son. He told him, from now on, you will eat at the king's table all the days of your life. That was a huge honor. Mephibosheth sat at the king's table with his sons, with his princes, with his rulers and leaders. That was a high honor for Mephibosheth. David said, you will eat at my table all the days of your life. And we're told that he did. For these guys to be given the king's food and drink from the table of the king was a huge honor. And Daniel says, no, I don't want it. Why? Because he couldn't be sure it would be prepared according to the law of Moses. And so he was a man of principle. As an old man, in Daniel 5:13-17, principle is still there. He refused the gifts of Belshazzar. That meant, I can't be bought. You can't pay me for my services to tell you to use a spiritual gift that's not from me, it is from God. He refused the gifts. He said, keep it or give it to someone else. Do with it what you will, but I will help you. He says, I can't be bought. Under the penalty of death, he refused to obey the decree of Darius the Persian king in Daniel 6 and verse 10. He knew the document was signed. He knew the consequences. Just as in Daniel chapter 3, his three friends knew the consequence of not bowing to that golden idol. They knew that there was a fiery furnace at the end of that decision. And they too were men of principle. And they said, we will not bow. It doesn't matter what you do to us. It doesn't matter what you threaten, what you promise, we will not bow. Daniel was that kind of man as well. He knew that the decree was signed. And he already had his windows open to Jerusalem. This again is in accordance with God's will. If you go back to 1 Kings chapter 8, the dedication to the Solomon's temple. Solomon prays to God. And in that prayer, when God responds back to Solomon, God says, even if your people are in a foreign land, if they will pray to me towards Jerusalem, where my name sits in this temple, I will hear their prayers. I will answer them. Even in captivity, Daniel has his windows open towards Jerusalem in accordance with God's will there from 1 Kings chapter 8. And he didn't close those windows. If he had closed those windows and still prayed towards Jerusalem, perhaps his enemies might not have seen him. But it said he had a habit. It was a habit of prayer that he did every day, 3 times with his windows open toward Jerusalem. He didn't care that that decree was signed. He knew that a lion's den awaited the end of that decision. And he prayed before God anyway. What it tells us is that he could be trusted. He was trusted by the king in his affairs, and he was trusted by his own peers that they could find him praying. The application for us as Christians are to be people of principle. Just from this account, we don't even have to look at the Joseph account or many other accounts like it. Just from this account, we can see mankind, other people, admire people of principle. They may not like you. They may not like your principles, but they admire people of principle. Outwardly, they may ridicule them, but inwardly, they respect it on a level. Perhaps they even envy it. Daniel's peers respected it on a level. They knew where they could find him because it was a habit and it was well known. In Psalm 15, 1-5. In Psalm 15, 1-5, in a rare time, I'm going to ask you to turn from the book of Daniel over to Psalm 15. In Psalm 15. We're going to read verses 1-5. This tells us it's a Psalm of David, but I notice some headings in other versions describe this as a citizen of Zion. Some headings say Citizen of Zion, a Psalm of David. Psalm 15, it says, O Lord, who may abide in your tent, who may dwell on your holy hill, he who walks with integrity and works righteousness and speaks truth in his heart. He does not slander with his tongue, nor does evil to his neighbor, nor takes up a reproach against his friend, in whose eyes a reprobate is despised, but who honors those who fear the Lord. He swears to his own hurt and does not change. He does not put out his money at interest, nor does he take a bribe against the innocent. He who does these things will never be shaken. David asks a question, O Lord, who may abide in your tent? Who may dwell on your holy hill? And he gives the answer. The one that walks in integrity. Integrity is principle. Never compromise your principle. Daniel didn't. And he was highly esteemed by men. He was highly esteemed by God. David says this is the ideal, the obedient child of God, and one that may dwell with God. 2 Peter 1, 5-11 gives us another list. Peter says the one who practices these things will never stumble. Where we add to our faith self-control, we add to our faith love, we add to our faith discipline, that self-control, principle. Christians are to be people of moral excellence. He says, add to your faith moral excellence. That's virtue. That's how you're trusted. Daniel was a man who was trusted. People of principle are highly sought after by God and by men. Employers want men and women of principle. Your teachers want to see students that are men and women of principle, who will not cheat. And if they do, if they fail a test or don't do as well as they thought, instead of cheating, they just make themselves better. You dive into that study book. You do what you need to do to learn it, to know it, to excel. On the job, your employers are looking for men and women who will not compromise their integrity to get something done, but will hold to that ideal, to hold to their principles. Dare to be like Daniel and be a person of principle rather than of price. Belshazzar thought he could buy Daniel's talent and ability. Daniel refused, and he said no. The next P that we're going to look at is Daniel was a man of purity. He was a man of purpose, principle, and purity. Daniel not only possessed godly purpose and principle, but he exemplified purity. I want you to look in Daniel chapter 6, 1-4. In Daniel chapter 6, 1-4. It seemed good to Darius to appoint 120 satraps over the kingdom. That is the Persian equivalent of a governor. That they would be in charge of the whole kingdom. And over them 3 commissioners, of whom Daniel was one, that these satraps might be accountable to them, and the king might not suffer loss. So instead of the king having to deal with all 120, these 120 answered to 3. That's a much easier number for the king to deal with on a daily basis. Is these 3 men, of whom Daniel was one, would then be over these 120 satraps. Then this Daniel began distinguishing himself among the commissioners and satraps because he possessed an extraordinary spirit. And the king planned to appoint him over the entire kingdom. Daniel was a man of purpose, principle, and purity, and the king knew it. He saw it, and he was going to elevate Daniel over those 3. I want you to see, he was going to create a new position for Daniel. He was going to put him over the 3. And then it would really ease the king's burden, because then those 3 would answer to Daniel, Daniel would answer to the king, and the king would only have to deal with Daniel. Then the commissioners and satraps began trying to find a ground of accusation against Daniel in regard to government affairs. But they could find no ground of accusation or evidence of corruption, inasmuch as he was faithful, and no negligence or corruption was to be found in him. That's an amazing statement to me. Because there's an old saying that says, if someone wants to find dirt on you, if they look hard enough, they will. These guys were looking for dirt. They had their hoovers out, and they were looking for any speck that they could hang on to. And they found nothing. They looked in his business affairs. They tried to find grounds of accusation on corruption charges, negligence. So even when they could find no corruption, they wanted to say, there's things he's omitting. We could find negligence. No, they couldn't find it. You know, I want to tell you a personal story of one of the hardest times in my life was when I lost my favorite job at that point in time. When I lived in Washington State, one of my absolute favorite jobs, the most favorite job I had till I got to Alaska, was I was a fraud investigator for a bank. I got promoted from customer service into their fraud department, and I loved it. I thought that I had excelled at it, and that was really up my alley. That's what I wanted to do. I'd been at that job just about a year, and things started to not feel right. It felt like there was a shadow behind me. Someone was out to get me, and I had no idea who it was. Then there was an accusation leveled against me that came when I didn't know it on a Friday night. I come into the office Monday, and I'm called into the office, and it's my boss's boss and the HR guy. And if you ever worked in the corporate world, to see your boss or your boss's boss and the HR guy in a secret meeting that you didn't know anything about, it's never good. And so already my hackles are up and I panicked. I'm like, what's going on? And they tell me that this accusation was leveled against me. And through the whole thing, they never asked for my side. They just told me how bad it was and that, this was a serious charge. And anyway, they told me that when I finally asked them if I could answer for myself, they said, tomorrow. Gather whatever evidence you have and bring it tomorrow. We'll have another meeting. So I said, great. So I did. And I came into that meeting the next day very confident because I had the evidence and I laid it out before them. But as I laid it out before them, I saw they already had papers that both my boss's boss and the HR guy had already signed. And I knew what those papers were. And that meant it didn't matter what my evidence was. And so as they then told me, yeah, we see your evidence. We understand. We're still going through with letting you go. And at that point, without anything left to lose, I said, why? What have I done? And they said, it's not that you did anything. It's the seriousness of the charge. We're in the fraud management department, and other departments look in on us. We're kind of in a glass bowl. And so we have to be above reproach. And the fact that just this charge was made against you, we're letting you go on the seriousness of the charge. And I walked away saying, you could just about take anybody's job there under that logic. All you have to do is make a terrible accusation. You don't need any evidence. It's not that they looked and found dirt. They made something completely up. And I was let go for it. And that was a hard thing for me. And I'll tell you, reading Daniel chapter 6 was one of my comfort zones in the next couple months while I was looking for a new job. Because it happened to Daniel too. They looked and they looked for something. But it's an amazing thing to read in verse 4. That at the position that he was at, about to be promoted to the second in command next to Darius, he was faultless in his business affairs. No negligence or corruption was to be found in him. Could we say that of any of our politicians today? I don't think we could find a one, even if it's the guy that we like, the guy that we vote for, the gal that we vote for. If someone looks hard enough, they're going to find negligence or corruption. This would help to explain his rise to positions of great power and responsibility, because he could be trusted in all things. And of course, his purity in business affairs was related to his purpose to please God, his principle to not compromise, and therefore came his trustworthiness. And mankind saw it. The kings saw it. As we look at an application in Daniel chapter 6, Christians are to maintain that purity of conduct, whether young or old. Paul says this to 1 Timothy in chapter 4 and verse 12 of 1 Timothy. Titus chapter 2, 6 to 8. We are to be men of purity. We are to be people of purity. Free or bondmen in Titus chapter 2, 9 to 10 applies to workers today. That we are to put God first. What I want you to do, though, is in a rare moment or return from Daniel, you want to look over with me in Colossians chapter 3 and see how this principle is to play out in our lives, even on the job. You can't just check your Christianity at home as you clock in at work. In Colossians 3:23-24. Colossians 3:23-24. Whatever you do, do your work heartily as for the Lord, rather than for men, knowing that from the Lord you'll receive the reward of the inheritance. It is the Lord Christ whom you serve. That is an important aspect that we have to remember when we go into the job force. When we go onto the job, our boss, our boss's boss, no matter who it is up the chain, they're not ultimately our employer. It is Christ. He sees what we do. He sees how we behave. He sees whether we compromise that principle or that purpose in pleasing God to get ahead in that job. And He sees who we put first on the job. Daniel was a man that never forgot he served God. And it's evident throughout his life. It's evident in his business affairs. As Christians, we are to maintain purity in dealing with others. And those that do are often given positions of great responsibility and privilege, because even other mankind, even other humans recognize that is a person that can be trusted. That is a person that we can trust with our company. That's a person we can trust with this or with that. Positions of classified security clearance. They undergo extensive background history to see if they are financially responsible. What they're really looking for is, are they above taking a bribe? Or are they prime candidates for taking a bribe? And if they think that you're willing to take a bribe, you won't get that top security clearance job that you've been wanting. You must be that person of principle, of purpose, and purity. Dare to be like Daniel in maintaining purity of conduct with others. But all of those P's, purpose, principle, purity, would be meaningless without this fourth one. Daniel was a man of prayer. Having purpose, principle, and purity is all well and good. But what ties it all together is Daniel was a man of prayer. In Daniel 6:10 and chapter 9, 20-23, we read in Daniel chapter 6 and verse 10, he knew the document was signed, but yet he entered his house. He continued kneeling on his knees 3 times a day, praying and giving thanks to his God as he had been doing previously. So it was a habit, and he didn't change just because these guys were out to get him. Just because there was a lion's den at the end of that decision. Daniel didn't change. He didn't compromise. In Daniel chapter 9, 20-23, Daniel says, writing through the Spirit, "Now while I was speaking and praying and confessing my sin and the sin of my people Israel, and presenting my supplication before the Lord my God in behalf of the holy mountain of my God, while I was still speaking in prayer, then the man Gabriel, whom I had seen in the vision previously, came to me in my extreme weariness about the time of the evening offering. He gave me instruction and talked with me and said, 'O Daniel, I've now come forth to give you insight with understanding. At the beginning of your supplications, the command was issued, and I've come to tell you, for you are highly esteemed. So give heed to the message and gain understanding of the vision.'" Gabriel is the angel that gets to give good news, isn't he? He comes here to Daniel and says, "You are highly esteemed." Later on, he appears to Mary and says, "You are favored by God." But here, as Daniel was still praying, the angel of God appears and says, "You are highly esteemed, and so I'm here to give you understanding of the vision that you have had." In Daniel 6 and verse 10, we get a glimpse of Daniel's prayer life. He knelt in prayer, demonstrating his humility. He prayed 3 times daily, demonstrating his continued dependence on God. No matter how busy he was, and was Daniel a busy man? One of 3 satraps over 120. So you got 120, and they might have separated that out where 60 they might have separated that out where a certain number was reporting to each one. But then he's so busy that now the king is about to make him over the 3 and create a position for him. Was Daniel a busy man? Yeah. And yet he took time out of that busy day to pray to God 3 times in his room in front of that open window to Jerusalem. And it was so regular that that's where they knew they would find him when they were looking for fault. What kind of person are you with your prayer life? If someone wanted to find you and catch you in prayer, would they know where to go and how to find you? I know that's an area of my life that needs improvement. You can know it for sure at the end of the day, at bedtime and at meals, and in the very morning as I get out of bed. But what about through the rest of the day? We need to be like Daniel and have that regular, scheduled prayer life. He gave thanks to God, a demonstration of his acknowledgement of the source of his blessings, even in the midst of persecution, while he knows they're looking at his business affairs. He's giving thanks to God. His custom to pray was so diligently, no doubt, helped him stay a man of purpose, principle, and purity, because he stayed close to God. And through it all, through his rise of power over the ungodly, Daniel didn't compromise. It was while in prayer that the angel Gabriel came to Daniel and called him highly esteemed, as we saw there in Daniel 9, 20 through 23. As Christians, we're told we're to pray often. Colossians 4, verse 2, 1 Thessalonians 5, 17 and 18, pray without ceasing. We're to have this habit of prayer. If our efforts to live purposeful, principled, and pure lives are not what they should be, could it be that an undisciplined prayer life may be the cause? Ephesians 6:18, we know the pieces of the armor of God, verses 10 through 17. But we sometimes forget prayer is what holds it all together. I call prayer the buckles and straps of the armor of God. Because without the buckles and straps, the armor would slide right off. At the end of giving the armor of God in verse 18, he says it all holds together with prayer. We are to pray at all times for all the saints, giving our petitions and supplications to God. We need to maintain that relationship with our God. James 5:16 says the prayers of the righteous accomplish much. Daniel was a man whose prayers accomplished much. Dare to be like Daniel in praying regularly to God. And this is an area of improvement that I constantly need to be reminded of, that I need to work on. What about you? We need to dare to be like Daniel. Many have the false assumption that to get ahead in the world, one must conform to the sinful practices of the world, adopt the when in Rome mentality. Some people do it on the workforce. Well, I'm away from home, I'm away from family, I'm away from other Christians. Who's really going to know? It's a sad thing. My father-in-law tells a story of a man that he worked with who he knew was a Christian. And it was a sad thing that later on he was talking with another coworker about spiritual things, and that other coworker came up, and the other guy that he's talking to says, "Are you talking about so-and-so? I didn't know they were a Christian." Ouch. That's terrible. Don't clock out from God when you clock in on the job. Like Daniel, like Joseph before him, serve God first and see how far that takes you. Serve God first above all else. Even today, there are many Christians who demonstrate when they dare to be like Daniel, they can succeed in the affairs of men without selling their souls. There are lots of Christians who find themselves in trusted positions where they can do much good for their families, for others, for their company, because they are men of purpose, principle, purity, and prayer. When we dare to be like Daniel, we can succeed with men and with God. So my question this morning as we close is, how about you? Will you dare to be like Daniel in becoming a person of purpose? This can start very early in your life, just as it did for Daniel. Will you become a person of principle, purity, and prayer? Dare to be like Daniel, highly esteemed by men and by God because of your godly character. Don't compromise for the world. When you think you're getting ahead, no matter what position you may attain, because we know corrupt people attain positions of great power. But you can do it the right way. You can do it the way Daniel did, without any evidence of negligence or corruption. Be a person of purpose, principle, purity, and prayer. And if you're not a Christian this morning, we encourage you to become one, to repent of your sins and be baptized into His name. And if you are a Christian not living the way that you should, don't wait till it's too late. Make those corrections that are necessary now. You can repent and be renewed. And whatever your request might be, come forward and let it be known while together we stand and sing.